I'm just glad I'm in a position to actually take action. I actually find it to be a privilege. So despite the difficulty,
Well, I think you're in a position to make it obvious, to take obvious action, right, as an educator, and with this platform that you have, and the others you were talking about. I want to learn more about the in person stuff you're doing. That's great. Um, but I really think that people have to stop making the excuse that they're not in a position where they can make a difference, because
okay.
they absolutely are.
So
They really
let me
are.
tell you a story about that. So my next guest, who's coming on in a week, he's a childhood friend of mine. He actually helped me build the computer that I'm using to do streaming for this purpose. He knew what it was for, that I was building it to like have something, a machine strong enough that I can, actually do this work. He's a racialized white man, and he said that the reason why he wasn't on the show is he felt that his voice didn't matter. And, I always question why pretty much everyone who's come on almost has said some version of that. And you answered that question for me as why people say that is because they're trying to minimize their voice. So it's a justification for them not having to take action and do anything. And I never thought of it that way. I don't know why, but you're exactly right, and it's funny because after like maybe a couple minutes after saying that, he told me a story about our childhood that I had never known about wanting to invite me to his hometown in West Virginia, and his parents saying no because they were like, we can't bring him out there. Like, there's a lot of racist people out there. And it was like one of the first times that he, saw a disparate racial impact in his life. I never knew anything about that, and I'm like, you really think that sharing that story isn't impactful or important? Just that one thing, So yeah, how do you think that we can get people to understand that their individual stories and voices are important in this context?
Well, I think the first step is to how we define voice, right? So it's not always about having a literal voice in a classroom on, a podcast or on television or whatever. It's really not just about a voice. Your friend, in helping you, put this computer together, knowing that it was going to be used for this thing, he used his voice, he used his talent to help support what needs to happen, right? To address these issues. So he actually did something that's unique to him. He knows how to do this, and he shared that with you in order to facilitate good work around anti-racism, right? So to me, that's him flexing his voice, right? And I think if people can recognize that, whether they're a writer or they do speaking or they are a leader at work or whatever it might be, there's no one way to do it. And it's not all literal speaking, right? It's not always that. It's how do you lend your talent to a movement? How do you lend your talent to helping somebody raise their voice, right, that needs to be raised, right? And I think it particularly from folks that look like me, there's plenty of times that where racialized white folks don't need to be the center. They don't need to be up front, but they can provide a lot of support, right? Whether it's the way we usually think of it, because we're in a capitalist society of financial support, or if it's helping to, to make the technology work, or whether it's helping to bring people to an event, whether it's helping to market, whatever it might be, whatever your talent is, right? When I first started out, I would go to conferences and volunteer at the conference on race and ethnicity or whatever it might have been, and volunteer just so I could learn, right? And I'd say, hey, whatever grunt work you have, I'm down, I'll do it. And that's how I would contribute until I, developed my own voice. And I think that everybody has a way that they influence others, right? Everybody, even the things that we kind of look down on. A lot of people talk bad about influencers, right? But on social media, people do make a difference one way, one direction or the other,
I mean,
right?
I've had people on social media tell me like, wow, you really made me think about this in a way that I've never have before, like
Yeah.
just directly being like, wow, like I feel like I'm understanding what people are talking about for the first time,
Yeah.
So yeah, super
There's
valid.
plenty of trolls that aren't going to listen to anybody. They're just on there to just yell, right? But there are people that are actually out there interested in other perspectives, right? And I think whether you find your voice on social media or you just use your talents to help support, it doesn't matter. That's all to me. That's all raising your voice. It's taking any action, and we all have that capability. We all do.
100%. Very good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And so I think the challenge is to empower people to feel like they do have a voice that they can utilize for that purpose, and that it's a worthwhile purpose. I think that's a big challenge. There's a lot of fear behind taking an anti-racist, way of life or value. Because people are like, oh, when does it end? Like that's a big fear. It's like, tipping the scales, if you will, of the racial hierarchy. People are concerned about that. What would you say to someone who expresses such a fear?
Well, there's two parts of what I heard you just say. Part of it is, tipping the scales, and then does that hurt me and my kids, right? And I think that it's dishonest to say that there would be no impact, right? But I think that there's also to develop an understanding of what it means to lose privilege as opposed to what it means to be discriminated against matters. Because there are a lot of people right now that are supporting this very racist and oppression-focused political movement that they genuinely feel like they're being discriminated against, right? But when they describe what the problem is, it's just that they may have lost a little bit of those privilege scraps I talked about earlier, right? It's not really that they're being discriminated against. It's that now they have to compete against a few more folks, and that makes it a little more difficult. So there needs to be an acknowledgement that that's part of this creating this change, right? So I think that that's a big part of it. The other piece for me is when people are struggling with that identity part, like identifying with whiteness. It is not the easiest thing to pull away from that, right? Because it becomes a part of a person's identity, whether they're conscious of it or not. And so that I like that you always start with the same question about race consciousness, because a lot of this is about consciousness, right? Because we're, the right likes to use the word indoctrination when they're actually the ones pushing an indoctrination, right? But what happens is that we get indoctrinated with these ideas at a very young age, and so they become very personal, and they feel like it's who we are.
And there's also, not a lot of chance for correction. Like you said, people will be talking, like 56-year-old people talking to you about when they were 10 or 12. People get stuck like that because when is the opportunity to change? Where does the environment where that occurs, like, where is it? For a lot of people, is nowhere, and it never appears, I'm not trying to give people.
I don't know about that.
I know. I'm like, I saw your face. I was like, he's like, don't give these people a pass. I'm like, I'm not trying to give anyone a pass. I'm just saying, and I think that it is a fact that environment matters for learning, and I don't think it's any different in the race context. A certain environment needs to be created to allow for people to explore ideas, to discard falsehoods, to deprogram themselves. It takes like a certain type of environment. And if that environment is never created, either by the individual, right, or by the surrounding environment, then it's very unlikely to occur.
Yes, I think you're right to some degree, right? Like I think of what was the theory? Morris Massey talked about significant emotional events being necessary to learn beyond emotion around these kind of issues in particular, to create a change about a perspective, particularly for adults, right? So you need to have some significant emotional event to move you off of your perspective on something like these.
Well,
right?
I don't actually agree with that personally, but like
I don't either, but I think that there's some interesting validity to it, right? So a lot of times when I meet white folks that had an epiphany at some point, right, whose race consciousness didn't happen until they were much older, and particularly their anti-racist consciousness, right? Until they're much older. Some of the authors that we all know, I won't name them and call them out, but some of the ones that we know their books, the white folks that have written books about anti-racism, a lot of them came to this, and you see it in their writing sometimes, as professionals, right? So they're grown, but there was an emotional event, something that pulled at them emotionally, that forced them to examine their own role, in a system of oppression, and then that's what allowed them to get to that learning, right? So the reason I brought that up is because I'm thinking, there has to be some sort of something that causes somebody to even seek out that education, that educational opportunity. Because I think there's opportunities, I know there's opportunities all over the place, right? It's not hard to find one way or another to learn about these things. If nothing else, read a book, right? Start there, right? And just like learning anything, like that's where I often start with people is how do you learn new things as an adult, right? Because we all have a way we do it. I know for me, I was, in high school when computers sort of started to be a thing, right? At least in my neighborhood, there were folks that had experience with it, but it didn't exist in my neighborhood until I was pretty much leaving high school. But I learned, right? And as an adult, I've learned how to use technology, right, as much as possible. Certainly not as good as my daughter, but I'm working on it, right? And I know how I learn. So, but something's got to tell them you need to do this, right? They've got to have something trigger them to say, you know what, I'm really going to have to learn about this.
Yeah, that's what I mean. What's the trigger? What are people? There's no triggers. That's what I mean. It's like the triggers are like people like you and me and the people we're trying to inspire to take action. That's pretty much it. There's a lot of triggers to suppress any curiosity that would spark such an event. So, that's all I'm saying is that I feel like that's the reality. And, I don't think that we have an effective way to fight back against it right now. Thanks for watching. For access to the full-length conversation and all of the 2-hour-long unedited conversations that I've had on race, click the support link in the description below. Thanks for your support and see you next time.